Welcome to Picture Mavericks, where every frame has a story. Today we are looking at a film that most people remember as a crude comedy about a talking teddy bear. And on one level that description is entirely accurate. But Ted from 2012 is doing something more interesting beneath the surface. And it is worth examining why a film built around an absurdist premise became one of the most commercially successful original comedies of its decade. Ted was written and directed by Seth MacFarlane and released in 2012. It grossed over $549 million worldwide against a production budget of $50 million. For an original R-rated comedy with no existing franchise behind it, those numbers are remarkable. The question worth asking is not just whether the film is funny. The question is what the film is actually about and why it connected with audiences the way it did. The premise is deliberately simple. In 1985, a lonely child named John Bennett makes a wish on Christmas night that his teddy bear would come to life and be his real friend. The wish comes true. Ted becomes real, becomes briefly famous, and then settles into ordinary life alongside John as they both grow up. The film picks up in the present day with John in his 30s, still living with Ted, and in a long-term relationship with a woman named Lori who is beginning to question whether John will ever fully commit to building an adult life with her. That is the actual story the film is telling, not the story of a talking bear. The story of a man who is emotionally stuck in the relationship that is forcing him to confront that. The talking bear is the mechanism. The arrested development is the subject. This is where the film demonstrates more structural intelligence than its marketing suggested. MacFarlane uses the fantasy premise to literalize something that is usually kept abstract in romantic comedies. The thing standing between John and his adult life is not a personality flaw or a fear of commitment in the conventional sense. It is a physical object from his childhood that became real and never stopped being the center of his world. Ted represents every version of comfort, avoidance, and nostalgia that keeps adults from moving forward. He is loyal, entertaining, and completely without ambition or responsibility. Being with Ted means never having to grow up because Ted himself is incapable of growing up. He is permanently fixed at the emotional register of a child's wish. By making that dynamic visible and giving it a voice and a personality, the film allows John's problem to be examined directly rather than through the usual romantic comedy shorthand of vague, emotional unavailability. Mark Wahlberg's performance as John is frequently underestimated. Comedy performance at this register requires the actor to play sincerely inside an absurd situation, and Wahlberg commits to John's emotional reality without undermining the comedy around him. John is not self-aware about his situation for most of the film. He genuinely cannot see that his attachment to Ted is preventing him from being present in his relationship with Lori. Wahlberg plays that blindness honestly rather than winking at the audience, and it is what allows the emotional beats of the film to land when the third act requires them to. Mila Kunis as Lori is given a role that romantic comedies often handle poorly. She is the person asking the protagonist to change, which in lesser films tends to position that character as an obstacle rather than a person. The film gives Lori enough clarity and patience that her position feels reasonable rather than demanding. She is not asking John to abandon Ted. She is asking John to make choices about what he prioritizes. That distinction matters, and the script maintains it consistently. The voice performance of Ted by MacFarlane himself is central to everything working. Ted has to be genuinely funny, genuinely fond of John, and genuinely limited in his self-awareness, all at the same time. The performance achieves all three without tipping into caricature. Ted is not a villain, and he is not a victim. He is a 35-year-old version of a childhood wish that was never designed to last this long, doing the best he can with what he is. The cultural context of Ted's success is worth examining separately from its craft. The film arrived at a specific moment in the conversation about a generation of men who were delaying the traditional markers of adulthood. That conversation was happening across journalism, television, and film throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s. Films like Knocked Up, Forgetting Sarah Marshall, and Failure to Launch had all engaged with versions of the same territory in the years before Ted. What Ted did differently was remove the psychological complexity from the equation and replace it with a fantasy object. John does not have a difficult backstory that explains his avoidance. He is Ted, and Ted exists because a lonely child wished for a friend and got one. There is no pathology to unpack. There is only a situation that made sense when John was 8 years old and no longer makes sense now that he is 35. That simplicity is part of why the film worked broadly. It did not ask the audience to diagnose the protagonist. It asked them to recognize the dynamic and decide whether they found it funny or painful or both. For a large portion of the audience, the answer was both, and that combination is what sustains a comedy beyond its initial theatrical run. The film's rating is worth addressing directly because it is relevant to how the comedy functions. Ted operates in a register of humor that depends on the contrast between the softness of the premise and the frankness of the execution. A sentient childhood toy that exists in the real adult world is going to encounter adult situations, and the comedy comes largely from the collision between what Ted is and what Ted does. The humor is not sophisticated in the academic sense, but it is calibrated with precision. MacFarlane understands exactly how far to push each scene before pulling back, and the film rarely crosses from edgy into alienating. The R rating also signals to the audience what kind of film this is before they sit down. It is not a film for children despite the teddy bear premise. That clarity of positioning is part of why the film found its audience efficiently rather than confusing expectations. Where the film is less consistent is in its subplot involving a stalker character played by Giovanni Ribisi. This storyline introduces a threat in the third act that the film uses to resolve its emotional arc, but the mechanics of that resolution feel external to the character work that has been built across the first two-thirds of the film. John's growth as a character is genuine up to that point. He makes real choices and reaches real understanding about what he values and what he has been avoiding. Having the climax of that arc arrive through an external crisis rather than through John's own decision-making slightly undercuts the earned quality of his development. It is a common structural compromise in comedies that need to generate third-act momentum, and Ted is not unusual in making it. But it is noticeable precisely because the character work elsewhere in the film is strong enough to make the comparison visible. Ted holds up as a film because it understood something about its own premise that it never lost sight of. The talking bear is not the point. The talking bear is the delivery system for a story about what it costs to hold on to something past the point where it is serving you. MacFarlane as a filmmaker made a confident debut here. He committed to the emotional logic of his premise even while surrounding it with broad comedy. And that commitment is what separates Ted from the many films that attempt the same tonal balance and fail to maintain it. The commercial success of the film was not an accident, and it was not simply the result of a funny concept. It was the result of a concept that was executed with enough structural honesty that audiences recognized something real inside the absurdity. That is harder to do than it looks. And it is why Ted from 2012 is worth examining more closely than its surface suggests. That was Picture Mavericks. If this breakdown gave you a new way into the film, subscribe and stay with us. Every video is built around one idea: that the best stories reward the people who look closer. We will see you in the next frame.